Hey there, viewers, be honest. Do you think there are secrets out there, hidden in places the public's never supposed to find out about? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know where you stand, because today, a U.S. Navy officer just confirmed the wildest rumor yet, claiming they found something not of this world in Antarctica. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Declassified Shadows. I always thought the past stayed buried, especially in places like Antarctica, where the ice never forgets, and neither do the people who send you there. But when I got that call, a call I hadn't expected after 20 years in retirement, I knew something wasn't right. It came in the middle of a cold morning. My phone doesn't ring much these days, not with official business anyway. But when I answered, the voice on the other end didn't waste time. It was crisp, authoritative, Navy brass. They told me to report to the base, said they needed me for a classified review, no details, just that it was urgent and that my presence was non-negotiable. I hadn't worn my uniform in years, but muscle memory doesn't fade. I pulled on my old jacket, the one with my rank stitched on the shoulder, and stared at myself in the mirror longer than I should have. My hair's grayer now, skin rougher, eyes still sharp, but carrying things nobody talks about. Memories you file away so deep they start to feel like someone else's story. By the time I reached the naval base, the sun was low, sky washed out. A young officer escorted me through the security checkpoints without much talk. They kept it tight, scanned me twice, checked my clearance, eyes watching every move I made. I'd been through enough ops to recognize when people are on edge, even when they're trying not to show it. Eventually, they led me to the archives, deep underground, steel corridors humming with that low mechanical buzz you only hear when you're buried under concrete and secrecy. No windows, no clocks, just rows of locked cabinets and flickering overhead lights. A man was waiting for me at the end of the hall, mid-30s, sharp suit, crisp posture. Didn't offer his name, just handed me a sealed folder. "Commander Hale," he said, voice flat. "This is what you've been called in to see." The folder was thicker than I expected. I opened it right there, standing under the buzzing lights. The first page stopped me cold. Operation High Jump. I've heard of it, same as anyone who's spent time in the Navy. 1946. Admiral Byrd leading a massive expedition to Antarctica under the guise of research. But rumors always said it was something more, something they never put in the official reports. Some called it a military recon. Others whispered darker theories. I flipped through the pages, black and white photographs of ice fields, naval ships cutting through frigid waters, coordinates marked in red, reports about magnetic anomalies, and then the redactions. Whole sections blacked out, page after page. Entire paragraphs stripped away, leaving only fragments. Enough to raise questions, but never enough to answer them. Then I saw it. One sheet slipped between official memos, stamped in bold red letters. Top secret. Handwritten across the top margin, almost like a warning. Recovered biological material. Non-terrestrial origin, 1947. I felt something tighten in my chest. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the air heavier. I kept flipping. There were mentions of recovered debris, references to unidentified aerial phenomena, but the pieces didn't form a full picture, because the most critical parts were either missing entirely or so blacked out it felt intentional, like they wanted me to know enough to stir old memories, but not enough to connect the dots. The man stood there silently, watching me read. Before I could ask him anything, another voice cut through the silence. "Commander Hale." I turned. A woman stood a few feet away. Sharp uniform, brown hair pulled back tight, a face that looked like she didn't have time for nonsense. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Rachel Vega, Navy Intelligence, younger than me by decades, but her eyes told me she knew exactly what she was doing. "You're probably wondering why we pulled you out of retirement for this," she said, her tone calm but measured. "It's not just about high jump. It's about what you encountered during your last deployment to Antarctica." That caught me off guard. No one had mentioned my time down there in years. Officially, our mission back in the late 80s was a simple research assist, weather monitoring, geological surveys. Unofficially, well, that's the part nobody ever talked about. I kept my face neutral. Old habits die hard. "I don't know what you mean," I said carefully. Vega didn't blink. She stepped closer, setting down another file, thinner but heavier somehow. "We've had some new files come to light," she said. "Surveillance tapes from Soviet archives, eyewitness accounts from a submarine crew stationed near the Weddell Sea back in '88. They reported seeing things, movements beneath the ice, unexplained structures, same coordinates your unit was near." I stayed quiet, letting her words hang. The room felt colder now. She tapped the file once, almost casually. "Thing is," she continued, "their reports match some of the unclassified fragments we've recovered, and they match some of what your team recorded before your mission reports got redacted." She let that sink in before leaning forward slightly. "Tell me, Commander, what exactly did you encounter out there?" Her question wasn't a request, it was a challenge. I looked down at the files again, the blacked-out lines staring back at me like old ghosts. My pulse had settled into a steady drumbeat, something deep in my gut stirring the way it used to before a mission went sideways. I thought about the ice, the weight of it pressing down on everything. Thought about the radio static at night, the lights we couldn't explain, and the one man we lost without a trace. And I thought about the orders they gave us afterward, the ones that kept my mouth shut for decades. I closed the folder slowly. "You already know," I said, voice low, "or you wouldn't have called me in." Vega's expression didn't change. She just watched me, waiting. And I knew right then that whatever was buried under those layers of ice, whatever they'd found again, it hadn't stayed hidden. Not anymore. Chapter 2. The Missing Expedition. Funny how your mind can lock things away, like old files shoved into some dark corner of a filing cabinet you never open. You don't think about them for years, decades even, but all it takes is one voice, one phrase, one classified file sliding across a table, and suddenly it's all back, clear as day. I hadn't thought about Antarctica, really thought about it, since the day they pulled us out and told us to forget everything. But standing there in that cold Pentagon room, I couldn't stop the memories from crashing back like a tidal wave. The sound of the wind against the metal siding of our outpost, the way the ice would groan at night, deep and alive, like the continent was breathing. It was 1988. I was barely 30, Lieutenant Marcus Hale back then. They sent us down as part of a joint U.S. Navy scientific detachment. Officially, we were there to assist geologists and climatologists, support weather stations, monitor the usual data points. Unofficially, though, everyone in my unit knew there was something off about the orders. The base wasn't anywhere near McMurdo or the better-known research hubs. They had us stationed near a desolate ridge, hundreds of miles inland, where no one outside classified circles seemed to know we even existed. No media, no tourists, no curious scientists outside of a handful that kept mostly to themselves. Just us, the ice, and a silence so heavy you could feel it pressing against your ears. I remember the first briefing. We were packed inside a narrow room, heaters humming against the cold, the whiteboards filled with diagrams we couldn't make sense of. There were printouts showing magnetic readings, lines jagged and erratic like a heartbeat under stress. Somebody had circled a sector of the ridge, noting how the readings kept spiking, even though nothing on the surface explained why. The heat signature was even stranger. Buried beneath 2 miles of ice, something was radiating warmth. Not enough to melt through, but enough to confuse the hell out of the instruments. They told us it was probably geothermal activity, some natural vent, maybe a volcanic pocket. But I've seen enough briefings to know when someone's talking around the truth. The faces in that room didn't scream curiosity, they screamed concern. First few days on station were quiet, uneventful even. We ran our checks, kept our routines tight. But it wasn't long before little things started happening. Our radios began cutting out more often than usual, static crackling through when the weather was clear, compass needles twitching like they had minds of their own. I remember standing outside one night, alone, watching the sky. Normally you get clear air down there, stars sharp enough to pierce through the black, but that night, something shimmered just under the surface of the ice ridge, not above, below. Like a faint light moving under glass, slow and deliberate, pulsing once, then gone. We chalked it up to exhaustion at first. The cold plays tricks on you, isolation wears you thin. But then more of the crew started reporting the same thing. Flashes beneath the ice, shadows shifting at the edges of the camp, instruments that read normal 1 hour and gibberish the next. One of the scientists, Peterson, I think his name was, claimed he could feel a low hum through the soles of his boots, vibrating faintly but steady, like some giant engine buried far beneath us was coming online. The others laughed him off. I didn't. Things came to a head about 2 weeks in. There'd been a small quake overnight, common enough for the region, nothing major, just a short tremor that rattled the supply shelves and sent a few crates toppling. But when the sun rose, one of our survey teams reported something unusual. The quake had opened up a fissure along the eastern ridge, revealing the entrance to an ice cave no one had seen before, not on any of the aerial maps, no record of prior exploration. They sent a team to check it out. My team. 5 of us, geared up with cold weather suits, climbing harnesses, and enough recording equipment to fill a truck. The entrance was narrow at first, jagged ice walls shimmering like glass, but it widened the deeper we went. Our headlamps flickered across the surfaces, catching glimpses of strange patterns. Grooves that didn't look like natural formations, perfectly spaced lines, angles too sharp, curves too deliberate. It felt wrong, like the cave had been carved by something with purpose. The deeper we moved, the colder it got, but not the biting cold of the surface. This was deeper, hollow, dead. We reached a chamber about 50 meters down, and that's when we saw them. Symbols etched into the stone. Stone, not ice. That alone didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been exposed rock at that depth, much less perfectly smooth slabs arranged like walls. The symbols spiraled and intersected, looping in on themselves. Impossible to decipher, but eerily rhythmic, like they followed some mathematical sequence beyond our comprehension. And then the bones. Scattered along the edges of the chamber, half buried in ice, were skeletal remains. At first glance, they looked human. 2 arms, 2 legs, vertebrae aligned like ours, but the skulls were elongated, the eye sockets larger than any mammal we'd ever seen, jawbones tapered unnaturally, sharp at the edges, teeth small and uniform. Peterson knelt down beside one, running a gloved hand over the ridges. "These aren't ours," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. I felt it then. That hum again, stronger now, vibrating up through the stone walls, humming beneath my feet, almost in rhythm with my heartbeat. We radioed back to base, but the static swallowed our transmission whole. So we started documenting everything we could. Photos, sketches, samples chipped carefully from the walls. I remember shining my flashlight up at the ceiling and realizing the chamber extended far higher than we initially thought. Like we were standing inside a vast dome, the top lost in shadow. That's when it happened. One of the crew, Jameson, wandered off, said he thought he saw another tunnel branching off deeper into the ridge. We told him to wait, stay together. But you spend enough time in a place like that, surrounded by silence and impossible geometry, it messes with your sense of direction. You start thinking maybe you hear whispers, faint footsteps echoing where there shouldn't be any. 1 minute he was 10 feet ahead of us, next minute, gone. We shouted, searched every corner of that chamber, traced the walls, scanned for any signs of another opening. Nothing. No footprints, no dropped equipment, just empty space, the cold pressing in heavier than before. Then the tremor hit. It started subtle, small vibrations underfoot, but quickly it turned violent. The walls of the chamber groaned, cracks spiderwebbing through the ice above us. Chunks of rock and frost rained down. We had no choice but to scramble for the entrance, our gear forgotten, hands clawing at slick surfaces as the ground shifted beneath us. By the time we reached the surface, the fissure had narrowed, ice collapsing in on itself, sealing the cave entirely. We called in emergency evac. By the time the higher-ups arrived, there was nothing left to see. The quake had erased the entrance completely. The files we compiled, what little we managed to save, were confiscated, boxed up without explanation. They told us Jameson was listed as missing due to environmental hazards. Official report blamed unstable ice conditions. And as for the rest of it, they pulled us into a debriefing room, made us sign papers that might as well have been written in blood. No one talks. Not to family, not to friends, not even to each other. I kept my head down after that. Transferred out within the year, retired early, thought maybe if I put enough distance between me and that place, the weight of what we saw would fade. It didn't. And now, standing in a Pentagon room 3 decades later, looking at those blacked-out files and listening to Vega's voice, I realized something else. Whatever was buried down there, we weren't the only ones who'd found it. Chapter 3. Admiral Byrd's Lost Memo. I didn't sleep much after that meeting with Vega, not that I expected to. The moment I left that cold room, carrying nothing but the weight of what I'd seen, I felt it settle back onto my shoulders like it never left. Memories I thought I'd buried deep enough to stay quiet were clawing their way back up. That Hume under the ice, the symbols no one could explain, Jameson's face before he vanished into the dark. I drove home on autopilot, the streets blurring past, headlights slicing through the dusk like thin knives. My house sat at the end of a long, winding road, the kind of place I thought would keep me out of reach. No neighbors close by, no one asking questions. For the last 20 years, I'd lived quiet, kept my head down, stayed out of the way. But the past has a funny way of circling back, especially when you think you've outrun it. It was early the next morning when Vega showed up unannounced. She was waiting at the gate when I stepped outside, dressed in plain clothes now, but there was no mistaking that clipped, official posture. She didn't bother with pleasantries, just handed me a folder, thinner than the ones yesterday, but heavier somehow. "You need to see this," she said simply. We sat at my kitchen table, sunlight barely filtering through the blinds. She flipped open the folder and slid a single document toward me. A scan of a yellowed piece of paper, handwriting neat but hurried. The heading made my breath hitch. Admiral Richard Byrd, personal log. I'd seen enough declassified material to recognize the signs of authenticity, the stamps, the signatures, the creases on the original. But what caught me wasn't the formality. It was the words. Flying crafts emerging from beneath the ice. Entities not of this world. Warnings of balance, warnings of interference. I read it twice, 3 times, the words burning themselves into my mind. Byrd's own hand, describing things that mirrored what I'd seen decades later. The tone was clipped, factual, but underneath it you could sense something deeper. Fear, maybe. Or awe. I glanced up at Vega, searching her face, but she was already pulling something else from her bag. "This came out of Soviet archives," she said. "Apparently they intercepted fragments of Byrd's transmissions before they went dark. It was buried for decades, only surfaced when they digitized old intelligence files a few years back. Someone finally put the pieces together." She paused, watching me carefully. "And it matches something you encountered too, doesn't it?" I didn't answer right away. My eyes dropped back to the paper, the careful scrawl describing impossible things beneath miles of ice. I could feel the walls of the kitchen closing in, that same sensation I'd felt back in '88 when the ground trembled underfoot and nothing made sense anymore. Finally, I pushed the folder aside. In '88, I said slowly, we picked up radio transmissions, garbled, broken, barely intelligible, but something in it sounded familiar. My comms officer said it resembled old Navy codes, phrasing we hadn't used in years. One night, the signal came through clearer, for a few seconds, just enough to make out a voice. I paused, letting the memory settle like dust. It sounded like Bird, clear as day, calling coordinates from a mission that happened decades before. I knew his voice from recordings, but hearing it echoing through the ice like that, it shook us. We thought it had to be some freak interference, but now I trailed off, knowing Vega didn't need me to finish the thought. She didn't press, not yet. Instead, she reached into her bag again and unfolded a series of satellite images across the table. High-altitude shots of the Antarctic ridge, grainy but detailed. She pointed at a particular section. Coordinates that made my stomach knot. Recognize this? It was the same sector we'd been stationed at, same stretch of ice where Jameson vanished, where we'd found that cave, those bones, those symbols. But the images didn't just show the ridges, they highlighted heat blooms, faint, irregular patterns glowing beneath the surface. They mirrored the data from 1947, mirrored the readings my team recorded in '88, but now there was a difference. They were moving. Vega tapped the timestamp. This is from 2 weeks ago. The patterns aren't static anymore. Whatever was dormant, it's active now. I leaned back, feeling the weight settle deeper. Years of silence, of pushing it down, of telling myself it wasn't my problem anymore. That all cracked open in an instant. The patterns, the hum, the things we glimpsed in that ice chamber. All of it was connected. And if the Navy was calling me back in now, after all this time, it wasn't because they wanted answers. It was because they already knew, and they wanted control. But before I gave Vega what she wanted, there was one more person I needed to see. I told her I'd think about it. She didn't argue, didn't press, just left me with the folder, the images, and that same quiet stare that told me she already knew the direction this was heading. I drove out that afternoon, past the city limits, down winding back roads few people used anymore. Ended up in front of a run-down cabin tucked deep in the woods, almost swallowed by trees. Rusted-out truck sitting idle in the driveway, satellite dish hanging lopsided off the roof. I hadn't seen Tom Bennett in years. He'd been one of mine back then, crew chief, steady hands, sharp instincts. But after we got pulled out of Antarctica, he spiraled. Left the service not long after, moved out here, where no one could find him. Word was he kept to himself, didn't answer calls, lived off whatever he could hunt or grow. When he opened the door, he looked rough, thinner, beard graying, eyes sunken but still sharp. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like I was a ghost dragged up from the past. "Took you long enough," he muttered finally, stepping aside. Inside, the place was cluttered but clean. Old radio equipment stacked in corners, maps pinned to the walls, lines drawn across sectors of Antarctica with dates scribbled in the margins. The same coordinates Vega had shown me appeared more than once. We sat across from each other, no need for small talk. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" he said quietly, eyes never leaving mine. "Whatever's down there, it's stirring again." I nodded, not bothering to deny it. Told him about the files, the satellite images, Bird's log. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "They tried to shut us up back then," he said. "Made us think it was all in our heads, but I kept listening, kept tracking those signals. You know they didn't stop, right? Years after we left, I'd still pick up faint transmissions on the old bands. Same rhythms, same interference patterns, like something trying to talk through the static. I asked him outright what he thought it was, what he believed we found beneath that ice. He didn't answer immediately, just stared out the window, fingers drumming against the table. "It's not just life down there," he said finally. "It's not just one or two creatures frozen in time. It's bigger, structures, systems, maybe even a civilization, older than anything we've got records for. I don't think they ever left. I think they've been waiting." His voice dropped, almost a whisper now. "And if they're waking up, it's not gonna end well for us." I left not long after. He wouldn't say much more. Wouldn't let me take any of the maps, any of his recordings. Said he had to keep them safe. But the look in his eyes told me enough. Same haunted edge I'd seen in my own reflection lately. By the time I got back to my house, night had fallen. I sat at the table again, files and photos spread out in front of me. Vega's folder, Bird's memo, satellite scans glowing faintly in the dim light. I thought about Jameson, about how he just disappeared into that darkness like a stone sinking beneath the waves. Thought about the things I glimpsed in that chamber, shapes that didn't belong to any world I understood. My phone buzzed once, a message from Vega, no words, just a set of new coordinates. And I knew right then the silence wasn't going to hold any longer. I stared down at the images, at the heat patterns shifting beneath layers of ice, and finally spoke out loud, maybe to myself, maybe to whoever was listening. "If they're waking up now, we're all in trouble." Chapter 4. Submerged Structures. The cold had a way of creeping back into your bones, no matter how far you'd run from it. I thought I'd left it behind when I left Antarctica all those years ago. Thought the hum of the ice and whatever it concealed wouldn't find me again. But standing on the deck of the USS Vigilant, watching the endless sheet of white stretch out to the horizon, I realized the cold was something you carried with you long after you stepped away. It had been less than a week since Vega showed me the memo, the satellite images, and the message etched across every file. They're waking up. And here I was again, right back where it started. The Vigilant was a research vessel on paper, flagged under a climate monitoring mission, but anyone who spent more than 5 minutes on board knew better. The crew was hand-picked, mostly Navy, a few civilian contractors thrown in for cover. The atmosphere wasn't like any science op I'd ever seen. Tight-lipped, watchful, too many classified briefings behind closed doors. Vega was already on board when I arrived, her face unreadable as ever, dressed down but still radiating that quiet authority. She didn't say much at first, just nodded once when she saw me and handed me a fresh folder with updated coordinates. Same ridge, same magnetic anomalies. The heat patterns had intensified since we last looked, now concentrated around one specific sector, the one I knew by heart, even without glancing at the numbers. I spent the first night leaning against the railing, watching sheets of ice drift past under the moonlight. The hume wasn't in my bones yet, but I felt it anyway, like an itch at the base of my skull. The crew moved around quietly, heads down, voices low. You can always tell when people sense they're part of something bigger than they're supposed to be. The next morning, we launched the first drone. It was an autonomous unit, slim and rugged, designed for deep-sea navigation and under-ice reconnaissance. The tech had come a long way since my day. Longer battery life, sharper cameras, sonar mapping that could render the landscape below in perfect, chilling detail. We watched from the control room as the feed flickered to life, the drone slipping beneath the ice shelf like a needle threading through glass. At first, it was all white and blue shadows, endless layers of compressed ice, fractured and ancient, stretching far deeper than most people could imagine. But as the drone descended, the visuals began to shift. The ice walls gave way to darker forms, unnatural patterns emerging in the depths. You could feel it in the room, the way the air changed, everyone leaning closer, breaths held. The drone's sonar outlined massive geometric shapes embedded beneath the glacier. Sharp angles, clean lines, far too symmetrical to be natural formations. Vega leaned in beside me, eyes narrowed, her knuckles white against the edge of the console. No one spoke. The drone pressed on, cameras panning across what looked like metallic surfaces half swallowed by the ice. There were reflective panels shimmering faintly under the dim lights, surfaces scarred by time but still unnervingly intact. The more the drone scanned, the clearer it became that we weren't looking at rock formations or fissures. We were looking at structures, man-made, or rather not man-made, but crafted, designed. Some kind of vessel, maybe. It reminded me of something half submerged in the sand, left there to rot. Only here it was suspended in frozen silence, waiting. The sonar mapped out the contours, long, tapered with jagged ridges that ran along the hull, symbols etched across its surface, faintly visible even beneath the frost. Symbols I'd seen before. My stomach twisted. I didn't need Vega to tell me they matched the carvings from that ice cave in '88. We pushed the drone deeper, circling the structure. The signal flickered every so often, static creeping along the edges of the screen. The engineers blamed interference, said it was normal this deep beneath the ice, but there was something else. Every so often the audio feed picked up faint vibrations, a low hum pulsing in rhythm, so faint you could almost mistake it for engine noise or feedback. Almost. Then came the shadows. At first we thought it was a trick of the light, something moving just out of frame, but the drone's camera caught it on the third pass. A long, dark figure slipping past the edge of the screen, elongated limbs moving too fluidly, too deliberately to be debris. It passed by in a blur, but not before the sonar pinged something dense, fast, disappearing into the blackness beyond. The room went silent. Someone asked if it was marine life, maybe a large squid, something disturbed by the vibrations, but the look on Vega's face told me she didn't buy it. Neither did I. The feed began to glitch after that. First minor frame drops, static bursts, then more severe. One moment the drone was skimming along the ridge, its lights reflecting off metallic surfaces, and the next the screen dissolved into chaos. The last image before the feed cut entirely was a brief, blurred frame, something humanoid almost, moving through the icy void. Tall, thin, limbs too long, head slightly tilted, watching. We scrambled to regain connection, but nothing came back. Dead signal. The engineers wanted to call it mechanical failure, suggested pulling back to run diagnostics, but no one really believed it. We all felt it, the weight settling over the ship, thickening the air. That night there was a closed-door meeting. The higher-ups debated whether to continue. Some wanted to abort, return to base, send the data up the chain and wash their hands of it. Others argued we needed more footage, more evidence. No one wanted to say the word extraterrestrial out loud, but it hovered unspoken in the room like a shadow draped across everyone's shoulders. Vega looked at me when it came time to weigh in. I didn't hesitate. "We keep going," I said. "Whatever's down there didn't just show up yesterday. It's been waiting a long time. If we turn back now, we won't get another shot." Some of them protested. Protocol, safety, the risk of losing another drone. But in the end, command gave the green light. We prepped a second unit before dawn. As the sun rose over the ice shelf, casting everything in that strange, pale glow, I stood on the deck watching the horizon. I could feel it again, the hum, faint but insistent, radiating up from the depths, the same hum I felt beneath the cave walls all those years ago. Back then I didn't understand it, thought maybe it was the ice shifting, the earth groaning, but now I wasn't so sure. It felt deliberate, like a pulse, like a signal. The second drone dropped beneath the surface just after midday. The crew worked in silence, eyes glued to the monitors as the feed stabilized. It moved slower this time, deliberately, lights sweeping the ice walls like search beams cutting through fog. We approached the structure again, creeping closer to the hull. The camera zoomed in, capturing more of the symbols, the strange, reflective surfaces. Some of the panels seemed to shimmer faintly, almost as if they were responding to the drone's proximity. Then, without warning, the ship shuddered. The lights flickered overhead, systems on board stuttering. One of the navigation officers cursed as the compass reading spun wildly, the magnetic field around us twisting out of control. Alarms began to chirp, minor at first, then escalating. Communication channels filled with static. I felt it then, not just the hum but something deeper, a pressure building in the air, vibrating through the hull like something enormous was moving beneath us, just out of reach. The sonar pinged again, but this time it wasn't mapping the vessel, it was tracking movement, massive, deliberate, closing fast. I locked eyes with Vega, her face pale but steady. "It's not just the structures," I said quietly. "Something else is down there." Before she could respond, the lights cut out entirely. Chapter 5. The Silence Protocol. The dark has a weight to it, heavier than you'd think. It's not just the absence of light, it's the absence of control, the absence of answers. After the lights went out on the Vigilant, after the systems failed one by one like dominoes, that weight settled on all of us. You could feel it in the strained silence, the flicker of backup emergency lights, casting the walls in that blood-red hue, faces pale, eyes darting. Somewhere out there, beneath the ice, something massive had stirred, and now it felt like we were caught inside its shadow, pinned in place. The bridge was chaos, voices overlapping, half the crew trying to troubleshoot the blackout, the other half scrambling to stabilize navigation. I stood by Vega, listening as the comms officers cycled through frequencies, trying to re-establish contact with HQ. Every channel spat back static, except for one. It was faint at first, distorted, garbled, nothing but a hiss of noise at the edge of perception. But then, through the static, something strange broke through. A voice, maybe. Mechanical clicks layered underneath, like gears grinding far away. The voice spoke in short bursts, syllables warped, phrases clipped and twisted. It wasn't any language I recognized at first, but the cadence felt wrong, unnatural. Then one of the techs paled, his fingers hovering over the control panel. He rewound the feed, filtering the noise, slowed it down. That's when we realized it sounded like human speech, but reversed. Snatches of words came through, jumbled and broken. Phrases like interference, balance, unauthorized presence, repeated over and over, the distortion bending them into something almost ritualistic. Beneath it, those mechanical clicks pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat laced with metal. Vega and I exchanged a glance. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't natural interference. Before we could react further, the ship's emergency comms panel blinked to life. A priority transmission, encrypted, flashing red. One of the officers decrypted it, reading aloud as the message scrolled across the screen. "Cease all operations immediately. Return to base. Silence directive. 1947. Alpha in effect." That name hit me like a punch to the gut. Silence directive. I hadn't heard those words in decades. It was one of those old protocols you learn about in training but never expect to see invoked. Buried under layers of clearance, designed for situations no one ever explained fully, just whispers. Supposedly written back after World War II, when the Cold War was in its infancy, back when both sides stumbled on things they couldn't publicly acknowledge. I scanned the rest of the message. No explanations, no options. Just a cold demand: leave now, shut it down, say nothing. Vega stared at the screen, jaw clenched, her fingers tapping lightly against the console. Her mind was working fast. I could see it, the gears turning, questions stacking up. She didn't say much, just ordered the crew to stabilize the ship, switch to auxiliary power, and hold position. But she made no move to turn us around. Afterward, she pulled me aside, out of earshot of the others. She had another folder in her hands, this one older, worn at the edges. She didn't hand it to me right away. Instead, she looked me dead in the eye. "I pulled some files before we left port," she said quietly. "Things buried in old Soviet archives, cross-referenced with our own declassified material. You want to know why they invoked that directive? It wasn't just about what we found." She opened the folder, flipping through pages, transcripts, meeting notes, surveillance records dating back to the 50s and 60s, documents detailing secret summits between US and Soviet military officials, summits that never made the public record. The topic of those meetings wasn't nuclear proliferation or espionage. It was Antarctica. More specifically, regions of Antarctica that both sides had agreed to avoid. Entire sectors marked off limits, not for environmental reasons, not for scientific preservation, but because, as one memo plainly stated, disturbing pre-existing sub-ice entities poses unacceptable risk. Entities. That word lingered. Vega pointed to one document in particular, a joint communiqué signed in 1962. It referenced sightings of aerial phenomena emerging from subglacial locations, language eerily similar to birds' old logs. It also described unusual seismic activity correlated with attempts to drill or survey certain areas. Both nations, despite being locked in a global arms race, had quietly agreed. Don't touch it. Don't dig. Don't wake whatever's underneath. That's when the door to the control room opened again, and another figure stepped inside. A man I didn't recognize. No insignia, civilian clothes, but carried himself with the stiff posture of someone who belonged in uniform at some point. He didn't introduce himself, just glanced at Vega and me, then pulled up a chair. "I'm with the NSA," he said flatly. "Been monitoring this sector for years. Thought it was time we had a little chat." His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the undertone. He wasn't here to make friends. "You're both in violation of multiple non-interference agreements right now," he continued, sliding a small device onto the table. It projected a digital map of Antarctica, sections shaded in deep red. "Those agreements were in place long before either of you joined the Navy. They exist because, well, because not everything under that ice was meant to be uncovered." He leaned forward slightly, eyes hard. "You need to understand, this isn't just about you or this ship. It's about equilibrium, balance. We've known for decades there are intelligences beneath those glaciers. They don't operate by the same rules we do, and every time we get too curious, something shifts, something reacts." He tapped the red-marked areas on the map. "Last time someone pushed too far, we had unexplained seismic events strong enough to trigger tsunamis. We lost satellites over the pole. Submarine crews reported mechanical failures, compass malfunctions, crew members suffering psychological breakdowns. I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides. And yet," I said, voice low, "you kept it quiet, buried the truth, let people keep poking around so long as it suited you." He didn't flinch. "The alternative is worse. We have standing orders to leave it alone. Let them be. That's the only way everyone stays alive." Vega crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "You're saying we've been coexisting with something down there all this time, and no one's had the guts to admit it?" The operative gave a thin smile. "Call it coexistence, call it survival. Either way, you're not supposed to be here." He stood, smoothing his jacket. "You're getting one more chance. Pull back now. No more dives. No more transmissions. Walk away." Then he left, no further explanation. Vega and I sat in silence for a long moment, the hum of auxiliary power vibrating faintly through the floor beneath us. The crew moved quietly outside, unaware of the weight pressing down in that room. I stared at the digital map still flickering on the table, my mind spinning back to the cave, to Jameson, to the symbols carved in rock, to the shadows caught on the drone feed. The puzzle pieces weren't scattered anymore. They were lining up. The government knew. The Soviets knew. Hell, maybe more people than I ever realized knew. And the one constant running through it all was this unspoken rule: don't interfere. But the problem with rules like that is they only hold as long as everyone plays along, and something told me the ice wasn't going to wait quietly forever. I stood, glancing at Vega. "You're not really planning on turning back, are you?" I asked. She shook her head once, eyes steady. "No," she said simply. Neither was I. We met with the remaining officers late that night, the ship still floating dead in the water, systems flickering but stable. I laid out the situation plainly. No lies, no protocol. Some of the crew wanted out. Couldn't blame them. But enough stayed. Enough who'd seen the drone feeds, who felt the same hum beneath their feet. I made the call. We'd go back down. Manual dive. No drones, no interference. If the government wasn't going to give us the answers, we'd pull them from the ice ourselves. Chapter 6. Contact. I never imagined I'd be back beneath the ice. Not like this. Not descending step by step into the same frozen corridors where my own memories had blurred into nightmares decades ago. The last time, we'd stumbled into the unknown unprepared, convinced what we found was some geological fluke, a freak accident of nature. But now, armed with everything Vega and I had unearthed, the intercepted transmissions, Bird's log, the NSA's thinly veiled threats, I knew better. This wasn't random. The place beneath us wasn't shaped by time and pressure alone. It had been built, and whatever had built it was still down there, waiting. We prepped quietly that morning, no ceremony, no pretense. The crew who stayed knew the risks. I could see it in their eyes. Curiosity mixed with something heavier. Maybe the same gnawing question I carried. If this was the last thing we'd ever see, would it be worth it? The ship's systems were barely stable, navigation still unreliable, but we anchored at the same ridge where the first fissure opened decades ago. The ice shelf above us stretched endlessly in all directions, white as bone, silent except for the groaning cracks beneath our feet. We descended manually, no drones, no backup tech, just harnesses, ropes, handheld scanners, and the hum vibrating faintly through the soles of our boots. It felt like walking into a heartbeat. The deeper we went, the less the surface light reached us. Shadows swallowed the edges of our headlamp beams, the walls closing tighter around us before widening again unpredictably. Every few feet you could hear ice shifting, like distant breathing, as if the entire glacier were alive and listening. We moved carefully, avoiding weak overhangs, every step deliberate. It wasn't long before the walls began to change. What started as sheer ice gave way to patterns beneath the surface, veins of mineral deposits at first glance, but too symmetrical, too deliberate. The closer I looked, the clearer it became that these weren't natural formations. They spiraled outward, intersecting geometrically, forming repeating tessellations that reminded me of the carvings from the chamber decades ago. It was as if the glacier had grown around something ancient, preserving it like. One of the crew, a young enlisted man named Parker, called us over to a section where the ice glowed faintly on its own. No external light. It shimmered blue-green like bioluminescent algae, but when I touched the surface through my glove, the glow pulsed, almost like it responded to contact. A thin web of fungi-like growths clung to the cracks, branching in fractal patterns, some kind of organism thriving in sub-zero darkness. Vega scanned it, but the readings came back erratic. Unknown biosignatures, no clear match to any terrestrial species. She didn't say anything, but I could see her grip tighten around the scanner. We pressed forward. It wasn't long before the walls gave way completely, opening into a cavern so vast our headlamps barely scratched its edges. The air felt heavier here, thicker, colder in a way that went beyond temperature. I could feel pressure behind my eyes, a faint ringing in my ears. The chamber's ceiling stretched far above, lost in shadow, and right at its heart, embedded in ice and rock, was the thing I'd glimpsed decades ago. but only now saw fully. It wasn't natural, no mountain formation, no geological curiosity. It was a craft. Massive, hollowed out like the rib cage of something ancient, its surfaces smooth and reflective under centuries of frost. The structure's outer hull curved inward in spirals, unfamiliar yet unmistakably intentional. Symbols, the same ones from that chamber long ago, were etched across every surface, lines looping into themselves, some glowing faintly beneath the frost as though alive. The closer we stepped, the more the atmosphere shifted. I felt it physically now, a vibration beneath my feet, matching that low hum. Parker whispered something, voice shaky, and I turned to see his eyes wide, darting around. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I shook my head. Hear what? But then I caught it. A voice. Soft, distant at first, threading its way through the air like radio static. Faint words, fragments, rising and falling. At first it sounded like echoes bouncing off the cavern walls, but then it sharpened. Clear, unmistakable. It was saying my name. Marcus. I stopped cold, scanning the crew. No one was speaking. Vega's face was pale, her eyes unfocused, as if she was hearing something too. Another voice now, overlapping the first. "Parker, come closer." The others shifted uneasily. I could see their eyes darting, heads turning toward shadows that weren't there. The sound wasn't coming from any direction we could pinpoint. It was inside us, coiled behind our ears, slipping into our thoughts like water seeping through cracks. We kept moving, but the voices didn't stop. Somewhere beneath it all, I felt something watching, a presence pressing down, silent but aware. And then, at the far end of the chamber, something moved. It stepped from the shadows without sound. Tall, slender, its form almost translucent under the faint glow of the cavern. Its skin shimmered faintly like liquid glass stretched over elongated bones. Reflective black eyes fixed on us without blinking, no pupils, just endless void. Limbs too long, fingers tapered delicately. Its face held no expression, but it didn't need one. The air around it felt charged, heavy, the same vibration humming through the walls, now radiating from its body. No one spoke. None of us dared. The entity moved slowly, deliberately, its steps soundless across the ice. It stopped a few meters from me, head tilting slightly, and then, without words, something opened between us. It wasn't speech, not in the way we understood it, more like a transfer. Images, feelings, ideas pressed into my mind in a wave, raw and overwhelming. I saw flashes of the earth, not as we know it now, but ancient, unrecognizable. Ice shelves forming, continents shifting, and beneath it all these beings, their forms flowing through subterranean networks, buried deep, maintaining something far older than human history. Caretakers. That was the word that surfaced, though it felt inadequate. They weren't rulers, not conquerors. They existed to maintain balance, keep systems in check, biological, geological, maybe something even more abstract. I felt their awareness sweep through humanity's brief timeline. Our wars, our machines, our endless scrambling on the surface like ants unaware of the ground shifting beneath them. But then came something else, a warning. Flashes of drills cutting through ice, explosions, vibrations tearing through delicate networks that had held steady for millennia. Each intrusion, each disturbance resonating deeper, shaking something vast and sleeping below the surface. I could feel it, something massive coiled beneath, old enough to dwarf us all, restless now. I understood. Every time we pushed too far, we weren't just endangering ourselves. We were pulling at threads connected to forces beyond control. The Silence Protocol, the Cold War agreements, they weren't about politics. They were about containment, about keeping the balance intact by leaving certain places untouched. The entity's gaze never wavered. It didn't move. But the pressure in the air shifted suddenly, urgent now. The ice beneath our feet trembled faintly, hairline cracks spiderwebbing along the walls. I gestured, one long arm sweeping toward the exit, slow but unmistakable. We had to leave. Behind us, the ground rumbled louder. I could feel the ice shifting above, groaning like some great weight pressing down, the hum building to a low roar beneath the surface. The chamber itself seemed to pulse, walls vibrating, light shimmering unevenly. I grabbed Vega's arm, snapping her out of whatever trance she was caught in. "Time's up," I said hoarsely. We turned, pulling the others with us, feet sliding against shifting ice. The entity stood there, unmoving, watching as the cracks deepened, as the cavern around us shuddered like something alive and restless was stirring from its slumber. Chapter 7: Collapse and Cover-Up. The ice wasn't waiting anymore. It moved beneath our feet like it had a mind of its own, cracking and shifting with each tremor as if some massive pulse was beating below, growing stronger, less patient. We scrambled across the frozen ground, the roar of splitting ice echoing off the walls, drowning out the sound of our own breaths. Behind us, the massive chamber where the entity stood seemed to collapse inward, shadows swallowing the reflective surfaces, the symbols on the walls fracturing as entire slabs of ice sheared away. The air had changed, no longer thick with stillness, but charged, alive, like the moment before a storm breaks. We barely had time to think. Vega moved beside me, shouting something over the rumble, her voice swallowed by the thunder. I didn't need to hear her words. The message was clear: move or die. The ground lurched violently, a deep groan tearing through the cavern, and I watched as one of the younger crew Parker lost his footing, sliding dangerously close to one of the widening fissures. I lunged, grabbing his harness and hauling him back as the ice beneath him gave way, a jagged mouth opening to swallow everything below. Another tremor rolled through, more violent, the walls around us fracturing like glass. We pushed forward, heartbeats pounding in our ears, the tunnel narrowing as debris rained down. The hum had grown deafening, no longer subtle, now vibrating through every nerve in my body. It wasn't just sound, it was a feeling, something primal, resonating in the marrow of my bones. A warning, one we were already too late to heed. The exit was in sight when it happened. A sudden, violent crack shot down the ridge, the ice splitting apart in a jagged line. I heard someone scream behind me, a sharp, gut-wrenching sound, and turned just in time to see part of the team disappear into the collapse. The ground gave way beneath them, the fissure yawning wide, swallowing them into darkness before we could react. Vega shouted their names, but there was nothing. Just the echo, empty and final. We didn't have time to process, didn't have time to mourn. The ice was breaking fast, too fast, and if we hesitated, the whole ridge would come down on top of us. We stumbled the last few meters, lungs burning, the cold biting deeper than before. By the time we reached the surface, the world felt tilted, the ship in the distance listing against the shifting ice floe. The Vigilant was battered when we climbed aboard. Alarms blaring, systems glitching, crew members running between decks, trying to stabilize navigation. Above, the sky stretched gray and endless, but there was something unnatural about the horizon, a faint shimmer, like heat waves, but in the bitter cold of Antarctica. No one spoke as we pulled away from the ridge, the ship groaning under the strain, engines faltering intermittently. Everyone knew we'd barely made it out. I stood on deck, watching as the ice shelf fractured behind us, massive sections calving off into the sea. In the distance, towering chunks of ice collapsed in slow motion, sending up clouds of frozen spray. The hume lingered in the air, even as the landscape faded, vibrating just beneath the surface like a heartbeat out of sync. But it didn't stop when we returned to base. The moment we docked, the mood shifted. There were no questions from the crew, no debriefs from the bridge. Instead, waiting for us at the port was a small group of men in dark uniforms, no insignias, no names. Navy intelligence, clearly, but not the usual faces. Their presence alone made it clear this wasn't a typical recovery. Vega and I barely had time to step off the ship before we were detained and led away from the others. The halls of the base felt colder, more sterile, each door slamming shut behind us with mechanical precision. They didn't take us to standard debrief rooms. Instead, we were ushered into a small, windowless space, a table and 2 chairs, nothing else. A single overhead light cast hard shadows against the concrete walls. They didn't ask questions at first, didn't give us time to speak. They slid papers across the table. Non-disclosure agreements thicker than any I'd signed before, laced with the kind of language that doesn't leave room for ambiguity. Legal consequences, dishonorable discharge threats, prison time. All of it carefully worded to make one thing clear. Everything we saw, everything we documented, never happened. Footage confiscated, samples collected and locked away, personal logs deleted, even our own body cams stripped from us the moment we stepped off deck. They didn't need to explain why. I could see it in their faces. The weight of what we'd uncovered wasn't something they wanted circulating. It was something they'd spent decades burying, and now it was threatening to surface. They gave us the usual lines: national security, global stability, consequences beyond comprehension. I'd heard it before, back when I left Antarctica the first time, when they made sure none of us ever spoke about what happened in '88. But this time, the words felt heavier, like they knew it wasn't going to hold forever. I glanced at Vega across the table, trying to gauge if she'd bend, if she'd sign and walk away like they expected. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes gave her away, calculating, steady, not broken, not yet. We signed. We didn't have a choice. The process was cold, methodical, like we were cogs being slotted back into place. But what they didn't know, what they didn't catch, was that Vega was always one step ahead. It wasn't until later, back in temporary quarters, that she knocked on my door. No words, just handed me a small, unmarked drive and slipped inside, locking the door behind her. She'd done it quietly, methodically. During the chaos, some of the drone footage, what was left before the first feed, cut out. Biological samples she'd pocketed during the initial sweep. Not much, but enough. Enough to prove we weren't imagining it. Enough to force a choice. She didn't say anything at first, just sat across from me, eyes hard, jaw set. "They'll bury this," she said finally, voice low. "Erase every trace. You know that." I nodded, the weight of it all pressing down heavier than before. The footage in my hand felt like a loaded weapon, proof of something bigger, something the world wasn't prepared for, but also a ticking clock, because whatever we'd seen beneath the ice, it wasn't going back to sleep quietly. News broke later that week, small headlines buried beneath bigger stories, reports of seismic activity in Antarctica, a minor earthquake they called it, shifts in the ice shelf, climate anomalies. No mention of us, no mention of the mission. Just enough to explain the tremors, the fractures, without pointing to what lay beneath. But I knew better. We both did. That night I sat alone, staring at the footage Vega had smuggled out. The images flickered on my screen, grainy, unstable, but unmistakable. The craft embedded in ice, the symbols etched across its surface, and in one frame, just before the feed cut out, the elongated shadow moving through the dark, pausing, watching. I played it over and over, the hum in my ears refusing to fade. The choice sat heavy in my gut. Expose it and face everything that came with it, not just the Navy breathing down our necks, but the wider consequences, the panic, the disbelief, the upheaval. Or bury it like they wanted, like they always had, and hope the ice held a little longer. But deep down, I already knew. The ice was cracking, and the truth wasn't going to stay buried much longer. Chapter 8. Confirmation. The camera light flickered once before settling, its red glow a pinprick in the darkness. The room was small, intentionally bare. No windows, no visible landmarks, just shadows layered thick across the walls and a single overhead bulb casting everything in muted gray. I sat where they asked me to, posture rigid, hands resting loosely in my lap, trying not to focus on the faint hum of the recording equipment behind the lens. They'd set it all up like this on purpose. Anonymous, stripped down, face obscured, voice filtered. The interviewer's questions quiet, deliberate, measured. I understood why. After all, this wasn't the kind of story you delivered on primetime broadcasts or splashed across headlines. It was the kind you whispered, carefully, to the kind of people who'd been watching from the edges all along. I'd spent years keeping my silence, years convincing myself that it was safer to let the truth rot beneath the ice with everything else we'd left down there. The official debriefings had made sure of that, papers signed in dark rooms, threats of consequences lingering in the air like smoke. And for a time, I believed them. Believed that maybe silence was the best we could do, that humanity wasn't ready to stare into the void and recognize how small, how fragile, how ignorant we really were. But something shifts in you when you realize the cracks aren't going to hold forever. You start hearing the same patterns again, the seismic reports buried under environmental bulletins, the classified whispers tucked between satellite analyses, and eventually, you come to terms with the fact that maybe the real danger isn't what's hidden beneath the ice. Maybe it's us. The interviewers spoke softly, their voice barely louder than the hum of the machines. I answered carefully, slowly, words measured like stepping stones across thin ice. Yes, I was there. Yes, I saw the chamber, the vessel, the entity. No, it wasn't a hoax. I could feel them watching me from behind the camera, gauging every movement, every pause. I could see the doubt simmering beneath their professionalism, the skepticism trained into them over years of sifting through nonsense. But I also saw something else. Curiosity, faint but undeniable. That's when I handed them the drive. It wasn't much. Select clips Vega and I had preserved, carefully scrubbed, encrypted, passed through enough hands to make sure no one could trace it back. The footage was old now, grainy, portions corrupted by static, but it was enough. Enough to show the structure embedded beneath the ice, its alien symmetry unmistakable. Enough to capture that shadow slipping past the drone feed, elongated and deliberate enough to render their questions useless. I could feel the shift in the room when they loaded the files, that subtle stiffening of posture, the breath caught in the throat. They tried to keep their voice even, but you can't unsee something like that. No matter how many protocols you've memorized, no matter how many theories you've dismissed. I kept my voice steady when I told them the rest. The entities beneath Antarctica weren't hostile. They weren't invaders, conquerors, monsters hiding in the dark. They were caretakers, older than we could comprehend, operating on scales of time and balance that dwarfed human history. They had watched, maintained, adjusted, ensuring the equilibrium of systems we barely understood. But there was a warning buried in all of it, one that echoed through the chamber walls, through Bird's lost memo, through the decades of suppressed reports and intercepted transmissions. Every time we disturbed that balance, every drill, every detonation, every military maneuver, we pulled a little harder at threads holding something deeper in place, something far older, far less patient, far less inclined to tolerate interference. I let that sit, watching the interviewer's eyes flicker. They asked the expected question next. Why come forward now? Why risk everything after so many years? I answered honestly. 'Cause silence only holds until the ground shifts, and the ground was shifting faster than anyone wanted to admit. The interview ended without ceremony. No promises of broadcast, no discussions of next steps. They knew what airing something like this would mean, how easily it could be dismissed as another fringe theory, lumped in with the noise. I wasn't expecting headlines. I wasn't expecting to be believed. But word has a way of slipping through cracks. Weeks passed. The footage leaked quietly, tucked into obscure corners of alternative media networks, circulating slowly at first. Some wrote it off immediately. Grainy, unverifiable, clearly manipulated. Conspiracy boards lit up, a flare in the dark, arguments raging in comment threads about authenticity, about cover-ups, about aliens and ancient civilizations. But beneath the noise, I noticed something else. Pattern. Subtle, but there if you knew where to look. Naval activity quietly pulling back from Antarctic sectors, research stations halting new drilling operations without public explanation, satellites repositioned, survey schedules quietly altered. Agencies denying everything, of course, but the movement spoke louder than their press releases. Vega reached out once, months after the interview aired. No words, just a message with coordinates, an encrypted ping buried in a nondescript email chain. I knew better than to reply. Just seeing her signal was enough. She was watching, same as me. Then, the final report came across my desk. Not through official channels, not through military briefings or intelligence memos. It was leaked, quiet, careful, a classified NASA transmission intercepted by someone who knew how to get it to the right eyes. Standard seismic readouts on paper, nothing unusual. But, tucked inside, the data points told a different story. Tremors beneath Antarctica growing stronger, deeper. Patterns not consistent with glacial shifts or tectonic activity. Rhythmic, almost calculated, as if something beneath the ice had begun to stir in earnest. The transmission ended abruptly. No explanation, no follow-up, just coordinates. The same ones we'd stood on years before. I sat there long after the file closed, the hum still lingering faintly behind my ears like a distant engine revving beneath layers of earth and time. Some truths I've learned are kept hidden not to protect us from them, but to protect them from us. And the ice, I knew, wasn't going to hold much longer.